Hey Beamer Tech crew, stick around because I'm going to show you guys how to install the new MMI Prime for CIC. If you're one of the many people with a CIC generation head unit in your vehicle, then you'll be able to enjoy the newest technology in your time-honored vehicle. As you'll see in the second retrofitting of the MMI Prime into CIC type cars, it's a bit more involved than it was for the MMI Prime for NBT cars that you've seen in our other videos. It's not rocket science, as BMWs from the last 15 years come apart like Legos, but it does take a while to do it right. So if you're not an experienced DIYer, consider getting the installation done at a professional shop. One more thing before I start ripping into the dash. With the MMI Prime for CIC, you don't need to remove the screen from the dash during the installation at all. It's easy to forget if you've done a few of these installations. Just remember to leave the screen alone. And here's a list of recommended tools for the job. To kick things off right for this lovely M3 E90, we're going to go into the trunk area and disconnect the negative terminal on the battery. In here, you'll see a cover. Remove the cover. Then grab a 10mm deep socket and a socket wrench and loosen up the terminal. Once it's loose, set it aside and we can move on into the interior. So let's grab a trim removal tool and start prying out these air vents, beginning with the driver's side, carefully working your way over to the passenger section. Once you have it loose enough, we're going to start by detaching the accessory button panel in the center of these vents, and then eventually we're going to disconnect the starter switch. Just apply some pressure on the backside and it should pop out towards you. Once it's loose, pull it forward and grab your precision pick tool and carefully push in the lock pins that'll release the clips. Now you can set that aside. Next, we're going to carefully let the cables guide themselves out as we turn the vent up. You'll see a ribbon cable that has a clip that just needs to be squeezed and pulled in order to release. Then you can set this trim paneling aside. Next, super simple, just pull on the air conditioning controls towards you, and it should pop free. On the back side, you'll see some slide locking pins. To release them, use one finger to push in the lock, and then the second one should loosen up the slider easily. It should pop free and pull loosely. Same thing with the next one. Then you can set that aside for later. Set these cables out the way, and then we'll want to remove the trim surrounding the disc player. Grab your trim tool and start prying. Be careful, as this is a thinner piece of plastic and you don't want to snap anything. Then we're going to grab a Phillips screwdriver and remove the 4 screws that are holding in the CIC head unit. Grabbing a microfiber cloth, we're going to want to protect the interior before we remove the head unit. Then with your hands, carefully glide out the CIC head unit. Pull it out and lean it towards one side. With each cable hooked on the back, there's a lock pin that you have to loose before it can pull free. Just continue to follow along. With the quadrilock, you simply have to squeeze, and then it should slide freely. With these 2 connectors, they're a little bit tougher to get out. So, one trick I have is to use your trim tool rocking back and forth to loosen up the pins gradually out of their place. We'll set that aside in a safe place. Now, there's a fiber optic cable in the quadrilock harness that we need to loosen up. Grab your precision pick tool and lift up on this lock pin. Be careful because it's a thin piece of plastic and you don't want to break it. Now that this is free, we're going to go ahead and grab our plug and play harness and move this optic cable into the same position on the Beamer Tech quadrilock connector. Then we can plug the OEM harness into the plug and play Beamer Tech harness accordingly. Line up the pins carefully and then slide the quadrilock into place. We'll come back to this later. Now onto the center paneling. We're going to start by removing the leather trim around the shift knob. Simply pry it and it should pop out. Next, we're going to grab a slightly more robust trim tool and start prying at the sides. Carefully work your way around, slowly loosening up the panel, and then pull it up freely. You'll need to maneuver the shift panel and leather trim through the hole. Then you'll turn it on its side. Grab a towel to protect the interior, pushing the leather trim back down so you can see what I'm doing. We'll squeeze on this white connector on the sides to loosen up the pin. Just pull it out. Then, this next connector, you're going to have to squeeze both sides of it and it should come freely. And lastly, the iDrive controller connector should simply pull out. We'll set this aside in a safe place for later. Taking a look at the A pillar on the driver's side, there's a screw cover that's labeled airbag. You should be able to pick it out freely. Revealing a T20 Torx screw, remove it with your T20 Torx bit. Then starting from the top, start loosening up the panel, working your way around the weather stripping. Along the inside middle of this pillar, there's a middle trim clip that'll pop freely. Be sure to grab it because you don't want to drop it into the car and have it missing forever. Then pulling the panel up towards the roof, we'll turn it around and put the clip back into place. Now to remove the sun visors. You need to grab your pick tool and loosen up this cover and take out the T20 Torx screw. Then, on the far side, remove these two T20 Torx screws. You'll see a power cable for the light on the visor. Using a pick tool, just pry out the lock, and the clip should come out freely. Pro tip, you can put your T20 Torx screws back into this place so you don't lose it. Next, we'll need to remove this paneling so we can install the mic cable. The headliner should be loose enough for you to put your hands into it. This is an easier way I find to loosen up this panel. There are two metal clips you'll simply have to press in and it'll pop down. Then we're going to remove each one of these cable connectors. You don't have to, but I did this to better show the installation process. Simply push in the pin and they'll come out freely. The three that are joined together are a little easier to remove if you unlock them at the same time. Then lastly, the mic connector itself. With your pick tool, simply unlock it and loosen it free. We'll set this aside for later. Then, grabbing your mic cable jumper, we're going to connect it in place. Then we'll take the other end of the jumper and run it through the headliner ever so carefully. Be sure to tuck it around the corner, making sure that it's nice and snug. We're not going to want to block the airbag, so we're going to pull it just behind it. We'll make sure we have enough slack to plug it into the panel. Next, we can plug the mic into place. It should snap right in. Then move on to plugging in the rest of the cables. Tucking in the loose cables carefully, we're going to put the panel back into the headliner. Lining it up properly, it'll snap into place. When you're tucking in the cable, make sure not to block the airbag, as that can be dangerous. With this access panel, we're going to grab a trim removal tool and start loosening it. This will give us a place to drop the cable through, to then feed it down to the kick panels underneath. You can see it's pretty easy to drop it. Grab your cable, dropping it down carefully, and then pulling it out with your fingers. Then, underneath the kick panel, there are 3 screws you're going to want to remove with a T20 Torx driver. Once those are gone, it should drop down easily. Again, the cable should drop down freely and you should be able to grab it with your hands. Once you have the wire, pull on the slack, making sure there's no snagging. Then you can close the access panel. You should be able to grab the cable through the open compartment where the CIC was previously. Just pull it with your hands. Then you can put the kick panel back into place. Making sure not to obstruct the airbag, we can put the A-pillar cover back in. You want to get the screw hole lined up properly. These two tabs will have a place that they drop in towards the front of the vehicle. You'll need to drop those into place first, and then the screw hole will line up properly. Make sure to tuck in the panel below the weather stripping. Snap the center pin, and then you can go ahead and put the T20 torque screw back into place. Lastly, put the screw cap back on. Now we can go ahead and put the visors back into place. For the time being, I'm going to take the bulky side of this plug-and-play harness and tuck it out of the way. We're going to take the other end of the cable, grabbing the aux audio cable, and we're going to run it down through the paneling. A quick pro tip is if you can find an oversized zip tie, it makes for an excellent way to fish cables in and out of the paneling. You can see when you tuck it in underneath the paneling, it comes right out of the opening here. I'll tape it on and carefully pull it down. Here you can see again that all the cables are labeled properly. The one labeled pin 2 will be for the microphone. Go ahead and plug that in. The one labeled pin 4 is what we'll be focusing on next. So we'll go ahead and grab our iDrive controller harness. And you're going to want to pull that down into this part right here. Tape it on and carefully pull it down. This one's a little trickier. You're going to have to feed it down while you pull it out with the other hand. Then, keeping it taped on, we're going to feed it up to the same part that the aux cable ran down through. We're going to need to pull enough slack so it can plug into the harness. Remember, pin 4 goes to pin 4. It should match up accordingly. Tuck that out of the way temporarily. And now we're going to start plugging in our MMI Prime. There's a slot just above the head unit area that it'll slide in perfectly. It dry fits well enough that you can actually put the paneling back on without it hitting the MMI Prime. So, grab the power jumper, pull it through, then we're going to pull our monitor power cable through here as well. Next, the Wi-Fi antenna cable. Then, we'll grab the USB AV harness and pull that through as well. Here's what we have so far. Then we'll run the LCD in cable like so. Then our LCD out cable, plug that in, and pull the slack down accordingly. Now we're ready to plug everything in. Then we'll grab this beautiful piece of MMI Prime gear, and I'll show you exactly where to fit it in. But first, make sure the cables are laid out accordingly. Then start plugging the cables in according to their labels. At this point, the dip switch needs to match whatever our monitor is according to the graph on the bottom of the MMI Prime. Then guiding the cables back into place, we'll do a dry fit of the MMI Prime. Everything seems to fit properly. Dip switches are set, and now we can run the USB cable. You guessed it, zip tie time. Just follow along with me here. We'll follow the same path that the aux cables went. Pull out the slack, and that'll be ready to go later. Now, we'll go ahead and we'll stick our Wi-Fi antenna into the slot right next to the MMI Prime box. Push it through, then remove the plastic cover and stick it down properly. Good to go. Now, we're going to go ahead and start dressing up the loose cabling so we can fit the CIC back in place. Now we can start plugging some cables into the CIC head unit. Grab your protective cloth, then the head unit, and we'll start plugging everything back into where it was initially. Keeping in mind the LCD in cable goes to the LCD in port on the MMI. The iDrive head unit cable goes into the pink port on the head unit. We'll plug the rest of this in. Grab the Beamer Tech plug and play harness and go ahead and plug that in just like the original OEM Quadralock. The best way to fit the CIC head unit back into place, you'll have to hide away the OEM harness in order to allow the CIC head unit to sit in properly. Carefully pushing all the cables back into place, we'll slide in the head unit, making sure it fits properly, and then we can go ahead and put the screws back on. If the head unit doesn't seem to want to go in comfortably, just take it back out and rearrange the cables behind it and give it another go. Now we're going to run the iDrive controller jumper cable. There's a piece of foam right here that you can nestle the cable in between it and the center console plastic. You'll notice there are male and female connectors on the jumper. Grab the female and plug in the male turquoise iDrive controller cable. Depending on what controller you have, you'll either use a 4-pin connector or the 10-pin connector. The pair that's left over will remain disconnected. Then we're going to run the USB cable up through the same path that the iDrive jumper cable ran as well. Now we can go ahead and start plugging everything back in to the center console cover. Everything should snap into place. Grab your iDrive jumper using the male jumper connector and plug that into the iDrive controller. We'll turn it around and we'll put this thing back into place. Carefully making sure that all the cables are tucked away properly. We'll leave the USB cable with just enough slack so it can hang just out the front so we can connect our cables and devices in properly. Then with some pressure, just go ahead and start pressing it back into place. Then we're going to grab the aux cable, tuck it in underneath the center console trim, and then we'll plug it in. There may be a little excess cable, go ahead and tuck that in the trim as well. Before I go ahead and reassemble all the trim back together, I want to make sure everything actually works properly, so I'll go ahead and reconnect the battery temporarily and give it a test. So let's press and hold the iDrive menu button for 3 seconds to fire up the MMI Prime menu. And at this point, I want to make sure the audio is functioning properly through the speakers and if the microphone works properly. To do this quickly, we'll take one of our devices and plug it into the USB AV harness of the MMI Prime and go to the iDrive menu and set the aux input option. I'm going to play some music, and if you select aux, see the song playing but hear no sound, make sure you have the optic cable moved over to the plug and play harness going into the head unit. I've done that so the music is playing fine, and I even went ahead and made sure the microphone is working properly, and with a good response, we're good to go. Disconnecting the battery again, we'll continue on with the reassembly. We'll go ahead and disconnect this temporarily and put everything back on. Don't forget to feed these cables back through and plug in the starter switch. And that'll wrap everything up for this one. Stay tuned for more videos about the CarPlay MMI Prime for CIC. We'll leave a link in the description to an in-depth pairing and user guide as soon as it's available. So, what are you waiting for? You already know how to install it. Head over to our web shop and order yours today.